Life on Side B is a ministry of pastorship, a missiological ministry equipping church leaders and parents on LGBT plus inclusion and care. Learn more at pastorship.com. Also, we want to thank all of our patrons who keep the podcast going and growing through their continued giving. If you love this podcast, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/lifeonsideb. Now, on to the episode.
Hello, Life on Side B listeners. So happy to be with all of you today. It is Elizabeth Black here, and yeah, I've been waiting for this episode. I think I say this every time I'm a part of an episode because the topics this season have been so good. But this is definitely one that has been on my heart, and I'm really, really excited to be here with an old friend and a new friend. So we have Ben and Adelynn here. Did I say your name right? Please tell me I did.
Yes, yeah, he got it right.
Adelynn. Okay, whew! Ben and Adelynn are joining us today, and it's just such a pleasure to have them here and to talk more about their lives and their experience. So I'm going to be an observer. I'm going to be a listener today. I'm turning it all over to you both. So let's just jump right in. If you two wouldn't mind, can you share, your name, how you identify, pronouns, and just a little bit about your life and your journey of reconciling your faith and your gender and or sexuality, if that's a component too. So whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So excited. I've been waiting for a long time to do this as well. My name is Adelynn, like you said, and I'm currently living in Grand Rapids. I am trans and my pronouns are she, her. I transitioned just about 6 years ago when I was a junior in college at a private Christian university. And
Wow.
yeah, probably about the 4 years before 2016, I definitely wrestled with gender dysphoria and how that would affect my faith and what steps I would take because of that. And so it's been a long journey, but I'm in a place of where I've transitioned and I'm walking that out with Christ and constantly trying to learn more about gender dysphoria, also educate others on it, and also kind of do theological work and discussion around gender dysphoria to bring awareness to the church. So that's what I do and what I like doing. So I'm so happy to be here.
So cool, Adelynn. Oh my gosh. Even just the first couple sentences, I have a million questions. I just can't wait to talk more. Oh my gosh, so good. Gonna be great. All right, Ben, let's hear from you.
Yeah, my name is Ben Schulke. I am also in Grand Rapids, born and raised. I would identify, I guess, as a transgender. I'm using they, them pronouns for right now. That may change in the future, we'll see. I think my journey with faith and gender dysphoria, I feel like, is still being worked out. I'm still trying to process things and figure out what God wants for me. I think really everything sort of came about 4 years ago, where I sort of came out to myself and have been wrestling since then. I think where I've really grown, though, is just trying to learn that Jesus still loves me. Like, he loves me as I am, in sort of the mess and the tension of not really maybe knowing all the answers. But I think in that space, he's been really, really good to me, and it causes me to turn to him. But yeah, still figuring everything out. But I'm grateful to be here. I love my side B people, and it's exciting to see you and Josh, Elizabeth.
Ben, it's so good to talk to you again. So I met Ben a few months ago at the Theology and the Raw conference with them and their wife, and it was so great to get to know both of them. It was awesome. So glad to talk to you again. And it was such a pleasure to get to know you and hear your story, Ben. So what a wise soul you are. And Adelynn, I'm sure, also is a wealth of wisdom. So so glad that you two are here. I'm curious. I'm kind of going off the prescribed questions, but I'm curious, since both of you shared that kind of coming to either coming to terms or coming to accept or realize your gender identities was obviously a lifelong journey, but something that really started to solidify in adulthood, early adulthood. I'm just curious, what was life like prior to that? Especially if I don't want to assume, but especially if you grew up in a Christian home, like how did you kind of work through or get to this point in adulthood where you could actually kind of face some of these questions?
Yeah, it hasn't always been easy. I think a lot of people now can look at my life and think, wow, like you have it all figured out. You know, you decided to transition, so you must have all the answers. And I remember when I first came out, people kind of coming to me and like assuming that I had all my theology worked out, that I had all of my faith questions settled, and that was just not the case. I made a decision out of faith and trust based off of what I was experiencing and the symptoms I was experiencing with gender
Mm,
dysphoria. And I kind of made a step without knowing all the answers. I had done a lot of discernment, but was still not sure 100% that this was going to be the best route for me or that this is the route that God wanted. Before my adulthood, I grew up in a very conservative denomination. It was one of those smaller denominations that had split off from another, a more mainline reformed denomination. Um, and so I was with folks that, you know, read the Bible very literally, believed in like 7 day creationism, definitely outspoken about gay issues. And back then, being trans wasn't even really in the language at all. So I was always kind of lumped in with the gay issue, if I can say that.
And
And
did you see yourself, like at the time, did you see yourself lumped into that, or were you kind of, did you just say, oh, that's other people, it's not me?
yeah, I actually never saw myself in that group. And for a long time, I actually had to work through a lot of my internalized like homophobia. So even like a year or two into transition, I was still very like not affirming. I was still kind of
Mm,
deconstructing what I thought about those things. So I never viewed myself as part of that group, but I kind of inherently knew that the words that were used to describe those people also applied to
sure.
me. So I remember
Wow.
being in kind of a Wednesday night kind of Bible study where we got let out of our kids' events and we kind of sneak into the sanctuary and kind of listen to like what our parents were talking about. And I remember them talking about like the gay agenda with like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a Christian like lawyer group. And I remember them talking specifically about how it's going to be like it's going to be gay, being gay is going to be funny today, but it's going to be accepted tomorrow. It's going to be like promoted the next day. And I remember my catechism teacher sitting right in front of me being like, that's so disgusting. I just like
Wow.
kind of cringed up. And so
Wow.
at that point, I knew I wasn't going to ever really say anything to anybody.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Thanks for sharing. I think it's really, it's always, fascinating how innate some of that is in all of our experiences, that like even when we don't identify within the LGBTQ community, and at the time just the LGBT or LGB community,
Mm-hmm.
that there's still something about it that it's like, but I there's something about this that hits close to home.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for sharing. Ben, what about you? Like how did your upbringing kind of play a role in your gender
Hmm.
identity?
Yeah, it's really interesting to sort of look back through my life because I can see a lot of things that I didn't because I didn't have the language. So I grew up in a home that wasn't. It was kind of a mixed faith. So my mom was attending an Episcopalian church pretty consistently. My dad would stay home, and he's a construction worker. So he that was his day to like not do anything, and I think he had a lot of pain from the church, and so he very much distanced himself from anything related to Christianity and faith. And I pretty much grew up sort of aligned with his beliefs. He was also sort of this like hyper masculine figure, and I never aligned with that, even from an early age, and just kind of really struggled with that. And there were some incidences too where I'm just like, I just didn't feel like I could compare with that. I had a pretty good relationship with him, but I certainly felt closer and felt like I was more like my mother, especially even growing up, just like a lot more sensitive, a lot, I don't know, just more, I don't know, compassionate. Those aren't necessarily feminine things, but certainly like my mom was one to listen and, be invested in. I very much, loved those things. I came to Christ as a teenager, and that certainly shaped a lot of my worldview. I sort of came to the place, I'm like, okay, I need to know if this is true. And I just went hardcore into reading the Bible and trying to understand, like, is this something that I can really believe in? And I found that I could, and I've seen Jesus move in my life in dramatic ways. I'm certainly not the person I would have been if I had never met Christ. But I never really like saw the gender dysphoria for what it was. It was like it was sort of puzzle pieces that weren't showing the full picture until later when I had the language. And the transgender conversation wasn't really a topic. I mean, you'd see some things about like Jazz Jennings or Caitlyn Jenner sort of pop up throughout the last decade or two, but and their stories always fascinated me for sure. But I was a youth pastor for several years as I was going through seminary, and had a teenager that identified as pangender, and so I want to care for this person, so I'm doing all this research, and I'm like, this stuff sort of makes sense to me in like my own life, and did some work on shame. So I think that was probably the biggest piece for me, where I started looking throughout my life, and there was the time through puberty where I remember vividly just like being frustrated with my body, very much desiring to have like female body parts and to be a woman. I didn't know what to do with those things. Like I didn't know who to talk to. I didn't have language for that, and so I largely suppressed it until I'm starting to do this shame work and seeing like I'm so ashamed of my body, and like some of these things brought up. And so that journey has continued, I think, onward. As far as like what the scriptures say about transitioning and like what does Jesus want for us, I think those are still some big question marks, but that's not really where Jesus has been taking me in my faith. It's more been like, do I really believe I'm loved? And I think it's been interesting. That's something I've wrestled with for a long time. And in some ways, I think God sort of revealed this to me because I couldn't just think my way out of it. It was almost like, I'm going to bring this up because I want to show you that I love you in the mess. And very much had an experience through listening prayer with one of my mentors where I met with Jesus and I didn't see shame or embarrassment or shock in his eyes, even though he could completely see me. And I think that's something I cling to, that I want to continue to go back to, and something I want to continue to promote, that transgender people are people and they're beloved by God. And that's what I'm trying to pursue. And I think, what that looks like is going to be different. I mean, obviously, Adelynn and I have different paths, but I think we're worshiping the same God, and he's been moving in our lives.
Amen.
So.
Oh, I love it. So good. And yeah, I just listening to both of you, I'm really inspired by the strength that the Lord has given both of you to really like go through this process with him. I can only imagine how easy it would be to be like, I'm just going to put my spirituality over there on this shelf and deal with gender and do it the way that I feel makes the most sense and leave God out of it. Like, and I think that there's probably, I would imagine that's probably a temptation for a lot of people. And we see that in the queer community in general. Like, uh, Adeline, I think you said it. I can't remember if it was Ben, but Ben, no, it was you. You were like, I couldn't avoid it, right? Like at a certain point, you just can't avoid it. So what do you do? It's kind of, it is a crossroads. But what's been really inspiring for me to hear from both of you so far is how you've really paved the way for so many other folks with transgender identities in the church, because we're talking decade ago at least for you, Adeline, and Ben. I know it's been a while as well, and I just think what a different experience you two have had than probably a lot of trans kids in the church coming up today. And I'm thankful, you know, as somebody who is cisgender, I'm really thankful that there are folks like you two have been willing to say, like, I'm not going to avoid this, I'm not going to live in hiding. For the sake of yourselves, but for the next generation. So I think that leads me to the next question of, you know, both of you have said there wasn't really a lot of language around your experience growing up. There wasn't a lot of conversation about trans identity in the church, and I would say even out of the church probably. So I'm curious now, you know, with the influx of representation and conversation about the trans experience outside of the church. However, you know, we're still the very beginnings in the church of how we talk about this. What do you feel are some things that are missing in the conversation around gender and faith?
Yeah, I mean, the cultural salience of gender dysphoria and trans identities and people is kind of a blessing and a curse. It definitely made the church more aware that this exists as a, you know, a like psychiatric phenomenon. I think in a lot of conservative churches, even a decade ago, people wouldn't even acknowledge the existence of like intersex folks, or anything that didn't quite fit the boundaries. And so what is good about this discussion and culture is that now people know it exists, and that doesn't necessarily change the way they approach it, but at least when you tell someone, it's a little bit less work now, I would think, as a young person being like, I'm trans. People at least know what you are talking about. I remember when I came out to my dad, even in 2015, it was just before the transgender tipping point that anyone was talking about Caitlyn Jenner and you know, different actors and whatnot. And I told my dad I was struggling with like gender issues, and I said dysphoria because I learned about the diagnosis, you know, at college, and literally had no idea what I was talking about.
Wow.
I don't even think I completely understood how much he didn't know what I was talking about. And so just not knowing freaked him out. I think the downside for it to being such a topic in society is that it's gotten also hard to tell when someone comes out as trans, what do they mean? Because there's a lot of types of trans people now. And I followed a lot of Dr. Yarhouse's work. He just came out with a second book. He wrote it with another individual, and I can't remember her name right now, but it's called Emerging Gender Identities. And in that book, he talks about how to parents, basically, that nowadays gender expression and being trans or having diagnosable dysphoria, they've kind of been combined together. So some kids, when they say they're trans, they're just telling you that I don't feel comfortable in my role. I want to express myself differently. They might not even be telling you, I want to get on hormones. I want to transition. I want to be the opposite sex. So that has made it more difficult for me to kind of convey why my story, like why I needed to transition, because for me, it was a very medically based decision, because I was very sick, and hormone replacement therapy really helped my physical health as well as my emotional health.
Wow.
And so
Wow.
that's been a difficulty trying to tease that out, because I think when the church talks about this and they want to make policies and make dogmatic statements about it, they're kind of combining all of that stuff into one group. And it's not very helpful.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I was hearing a conversation about trans identity recently, and something that has kind of stuck with me in a way that it bothered me within the faith conversation was, I feel like, and Ben, I want to hear your response to that question. Maybe this will tie into it. And Ben, you might actually know what I'm talking about, but I feel like there can be an idolizing of people who choose to either not transition, detransition, or kind of in some way, and they're not all the same, or some way suppress their gender expression within the church. Like, yeah, okay, fine. We accept and we know that people have gender dysphoria. We accept and we know that there might be people who identify as transgender. However, what we're really hoping for in this whole journey is that people kind of go back, so to speak, go back to the gender that God has created them to be. And I hate even saying that. Forgive me if by no means am I hoping to be triggering, because Lord knows I don't agree with this at all. But I just wonder, is that also a part of the narrative that you hear in the faith gender conversation? So yeah, Ben, I want to hear your thoughts, and then Allie, you look like you have some stuff to jump into. So
yeah. So I'll address that and maybe talk about some other things with that. But there is,
yes, please.
we have to have multiple voices. And so, I mean, this isn't even related to the transgender conversation. I mean, how many policies are made, by strictly just white men, like white cisgender men? Like,
yes,
that's not good. That's not the whole of our society, of humanity. We need to have multiple voices from different experiences. And so I think related to the transgender conversation, if a church is going to think about how to care and steward and shepherd their sheep who have a different gender identity, they need to do the work of learning, of reading, of inviting different voices of people who still love Jesus, but maybe have taken different paths. And I think it is true that one of the trends is to sort of have a poster child to say, like, look at this person, they haven't transitioned or they detransitioned, and everyone has to follow their path. And, I don't think that's fair to that person either. I think sometimes, and Adelynn and I have discussed this too, is like Adelynn doesn't get invited to as many things as some of my other friends that have, detransitioned or haven't transitioned. And so I think, that's not fair to the conversation, because there's a lot of nuance there. There's things to be learned, and it really is just about compassion, right? Like, can we so this is the piece that I think is the biggest for me in the church, is, can we slow down and picture ourselves in other people's shoes? Can you imagine what it's like to not choose to have dysphoria, but to be frustrated and feel this incongruence within your inner self and your body in the way that you like wish it was expressed, and you want those things to line up, but it never will. Or like you can go through these things, but then it brings a lot of risk, in other ways. And just because you transition doesn't necessarily mean dysphoria goes away either. I mean, there's a lot of pain. I mean, the suicide rates too. Can we pause as a church and place ourselves in their shoes and be like, okay, well, now how can that inform my decisions and how I treat someone? Maybe pronouns is hard for someone to use, but maybe it's a loving practice to exercise that, right? Like in my mind, when someone asks for pronouns that maybe are different than their biological sex, like that's an invitation to say that you're a safe person and that you see them as a human being. Yeah, it might be challenging for someone, but so I think certainly the compassion piece, and I think there's just honestly sort of an intellectual laziness in the church where we want to make decisions based on some sort of cultural presumption without actually doing the research, and like not just theological but medical and psychological as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so true. And isn't that the way of Jesus? Like Jesus literally put himself in our shoes. Like I can't imagine that was always easy. I'm sure that there were times where it was challenging, yet the immense humility of Christ is such an example to us. It's so true. Really good.
Yeah.
Talk to me, because I'm like mad that you're not getting invited to places. I'm about to have a conference just so you can come and speak at it.
No, that is changing. I have an announcement coming out later this summer, but I'm also starting a podcast called At the Table. And it's going to be rolling into also a nonprofit where we already have an October 8 event booked in Ann Arbor. That's going to be a queer worship night. So I'm taking a Christian artist who transitioned, is re-releasing their music, and we're inviting all queer people to come and just like praise God and be in a safe and fun environment. So I'm so waiting for October, because I just keep on getting that scripture. Like, if you guys don't cry out to God, even these rocks will cry out. And I just want everyone to know that even if the church doesn't want you to worship God and his glory and splendor, like, we're going to get the trans, we're going to get the people of color, we're going to get the non-binary, and we're all just going to scream our hearts out for God, because we don't know the answers, but we love him still. And anyway, but to address what you were talking about this kind of, I think, censoring of voices, is sometimes as a Christian who has transitioned, and that also helped my physical life and helped my my adjustment to life. It doesn't fit the narrative of transitioning makes your life kind of bad, and you're kind of this pity case, and like you're going to come back to the church and like confess it all as a sin. And I've noticed that in conservative circles particularly, there's a hyper focus on people that detransition, and especially a hyper focus on trans masculine voices, which is totally okay, and those voices and those stories need to be told. But it kind of feels to me is the church's internalized like misogyny coming to play again, because we're more comfortable with female bodied people presenting masculine, but we're not comfortable with masculine people presenting in a more feminine way. And that is because inherently rooted in some conservative theology is a kind of lower placement on the value of women. And I experienced this growing up as a young person, presenting male but feeling like a young girl, and identifying with those stories. And I remember growing up, and I remember thinking about, this should have told me I was trans back then, but I remember thinking like, man, I don't want to be like my mom when I grow up, because that's kind of boring. Like, I love the idea of motherhood and of raising children, but that's the only thing you're allowed to do. Like, that made me feel like that's going to be very boring. And so I just kind of like want to call that out, because I've, felt like sometimes like I'm a smoke screen where I get invited once or twice, and it's like, okay, we've talked to a trans person, now we can keep on saying to you, and I get this pointed at me like, well, this person, like, they're living the way God's intention is and they're doing fine. I'm like, but they're also presenting masculine, sometimes using different pronouns. Like, that option wasn't available to me, even if I wasn't having all my medical issues, because no one would love that for me walking into church like with a dress and, makeup as a non-transition
Wow.
male. So that's one. Two, about slowing down, Ben's idea about slowing down. I've been kind of going through a different type of faith crisis recently, where I've been exploring the Catholic Church for a long time, but a lot of that is centered in my desire to learn about what the early church was. And I'm starting to uncover some threads that where even today, I don't know what church to go to, because sometimes I see the Catholic Church is more right in some areas, and then the Protestant Church is more correct in other areas. But one thing I'm noticing is that Christianity from the beginning was a bunch of groups constantly fighting over what was right. Because when we know truth and we know we have truth, we have to be very careful about what that truth is. And therefore that it makes debate happen, because people care about the truth. If you don't care about the truth, you're not going to debate it. Why debate it if you don't care? And I do like the idea of slowing down, because I think the early church took centuries to come down on certain positions firmly. And I think what we're doing now, like I'm on a Side B podcast of someone that's transition, is a healthy thing. I was looking back into the early church fathers writing, some of the texts that the church calls, the church doctors, like from the early people like Clement and Ignatius and these folks that were integral into forming the first and second century church. And I read something out of a thing called the Didache, which was an early, basically catechism for early Christians. It just taught like, how is the church set up? What do you need to know before baptism? And there was a quote from this gospel it's not in the canon, but it was one of those books that was in dispute early on in the church, called the Gospel of Barabbas. I don't know if anyone's heard this, but he is speaking to these Gentile Christians about like how much do they have to, adhere to the old Jewish, customs, which was the big question in the first century church. And the gospel said, of Barabbas quotes, it says, "Do as much as you can to uphold the complete law of God, and you will be perfect. But if you can't, do as much as you can." And in that quote, I see a huge graciousness of the church of like, hey, we're all pursuing perfection, but realizing that some of us might not be able to get there and might have a lot of obstacles in getting there, whether it's our sexuality or needing to transition to stay alive. It's this idea that we're not going to be perfect here on earth, but we're all approaching each other in love. And I see so much in the modern church is like, we need to have a dogmatic statement, and we need to decide who's in, who's out, instead of living with the uncomfortable tension of being unified in Christ in a church body, and also having people come to different conclusions. So that's something I would like to see kind of infused into the modern church.
So good. Like, first of all, so excited about this podcast. I'm not in charge of Life on Side B, but I'm just gonna go ahead and make a statement that we're definitely gonna be sharing about the podcast. And can you give the dates and details about this queer worship night? Is that what you called it? What was it? LGBTQ?
Yeah, it's October 8th. I actually, my partner is booking the venue, so I'm not quite sure the name of the venue, but I can send it along to you guys. It's going to be in Ann Arbor, October 8th. So we're kind of getting all of our social medias together and launching that yet, but we're welcoming everyone to come. It's going to be a great night. Tickets will be for free, and you can donate to what we're doing. So it's going to be we want it to be very accessible to everyone. So.
Well, Life on Side B is there. I'm there. I'm serious.
Yeah,
like I'm ready to buy.
We'll love to see you there.
Hey,
so
come to Grand
exciting.
Rapids, because Ann Arbor is 45 minutes ish.
Yeah. Oh, that's it.
So we can all drive together.
I'll make it a whole.
It'll be good.
Yeah.
I'll make it a whole thing. Oh my gosh, how fantastic! So exciting, and thank you both for answering that question with such grace. And I see it too, and I'm sorry that I just see it and you all have to experience it. I mean, obviously there are ways that I experience. Adeline, when you were sharing about, what is more palatable in the church in terms of gender expression and gender identity, like, I totally get it, because I feel like I'm at an advantage as a married woman who is bisexual, that one, people kind of innately trust me a little bit more or feel more comfortable because I'm married. And then also because I'm a woman. And there's something like more appealing about a bisexual woman, but it's the patriarchy. Like, it's because we live in a male dominant society that thinks it's sexy and interesting for women to like other women, but less sexy and interesting for men to like other men. And I can only imagine the weight of that within the trans experience as well, as a transgender woman. Like, it's,
I mean, I literally had people say, why would you want to be a woman? I'm like, it's not really something I got to decide, first of all.
Yeah.
But like, it was like, why would you want to be that thing? Like, you're stepping down. There's this entire like for trans feminine people that are transitioning, it's like you're like this kind of inherent, like, they're almost implicitly saying like you're degrading yourself. And wow. I think that has been with gay men as well. I don't know. I can't really speak fully to that experience, but I know that like the transition from kind of ancient world of like same-sex relationships being very dominated, but like an unequal power structure between young boys and like they're like benefactors. What has happened with the gay discussion early on was like, oh, these people are perverse, oh, they're pedophiles, oh, and so when I was transitioning to a woman, it was like, oh, you're kind of doing something perverted or like debasing.
Yikes.
And that was difficult to deal with, I think, for sure.
Oh, wow. Well, Ben, I'm curious for you in kind of your place, and something both of you said earlier on as well, and I think should be reiterated, is that this is a lifelong journey. Like, you don't need to have all your ducks in a row all the time, though I can only imagine people expect that from you. You don't need to always figure it out. Ben, I love that you came in and said, hey, the pronouns I'm using right now are they, them, and I don't know if it's going to stay that way. And I'm okay with that. And I think that I'm so glad that there's room for that now where there wasn't before. But I'm curious, as someone who is in a different place in their gender expression, what does gender expression, and Adelynn, this goes to you as well, but I want to hear from Ben first. Like, what does gender expression look like for you, particularly in relationship to your faith?
Yeah.
And also, like, do you feel like you have license to express it?
I don't. Not really. I think there's there's some things, for sure. Excuse me. I think right now I'm still trying to learn who I am and to have the freedom to live that out. And to not be living in fear of what other people think. Totally, trying to push against my childhood and all the wounding, right? Like, I think part of my story is I was given this image of like, I've often had to be the mortar, not the brick. I've had to fit into what other people need. And so some of my journey and healing has been to be more of a brick and to be sure of who I am and to be able to say no or to do things that might not, fit the sort of masculine image, but like to have some freedom. So like, one thing has been piercings. I've really enjoyed, like, sort of exploring, sort of that expression has been really good. I think too, just like maybe things and interests and even how I talk, I think are pieces of that. I think pronouns is even a step for that, to like, there was some fear of like, well, what are people going to think? And ultimately, like, I found that was bringing some peace, right? Like, there was always a little bit of tension there with masculine pronouns, and not like I, will crumble if someone says he or his, but I feel more seen, I think, when people are using they them. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. But I don't know. I think part of it too is I'm married, and there's sort of, I mean, within any marriage, there's a level of compromise that has to happen. And so, trying to navigate those things, at first, body hair was kind of an issue, but I'm comfortable, shaving off body hair to just like try to get rid of some of that, the things that bring dysphoria. So, I mean, there's limited things. I think they're all relatively, I'd say, like, superficial, but there are some things that either it's fear or it's, it's sort of a level of compromise too with my wife, that I want to make sure that she's doing well. Then it is a challenge. I'm still trying to figure that out, but I guess at the end of the day, I'm trying to learn how to be positive about my body and who I am. As it is, and that,
let me know when you figure that one out.
It's such a fight. It's such a fight.
Oh my gosh.
There's so many messages that I've been told and tell myself that are so painful and terrible. And so I'm, I think that's one of my goals in counseling and even just my life, like, to remember. And I think one thing that's been helpful is just to remember, like, okay, I would never say things to another human being that I say it to myself in my own head. And so part of it is like learning to say, okay, I'm actually worthy of being loved. I can include myself in this. And to remember too, like, to picture Jesus and how he sees me. It's certainly not the way that I would see myself. And so trying to like reorient the way that I think about myself. The dysphoria is still there, like, but sometimes that can help combat that, and I think that's that's where I want to go, is trying to learn that self-love.
Wow,
that's I love that. And I think one of the beautiful parts about being queer that I'm trying to accept and like be prideful about, be happy about, is that, like, I think we have the ability to see people for who they are. I remember sitting with Ben after one of our talks in Boise, and then like riding back on the plane and just remembering what I felt like before I presented the way I do. And but people would always tell me, I can see you no matter what. And that's one thing that God has always told me, is like, you are you no matter what. Like, you are this unique thing that I created. And one thing that helped me, I'd always go back to these passages that like were used as clobber passages, and then I really wanted to like redeem them. So I would like wrestle with God and be like, I'm gonna keep on reading this makes me feel horrible, but I'm gonna keep on asking for you to show me. And there was this very profound moment I had in the woods. I love telling this story because one of my favorite saints in the church is Saint Kateri, and she was the first Indian or Native American to convert to the faith. And she was ostracized for that. She was shunned from her community. So she's known as the patron saint of outcasts and converts. And what I love about it is she would just go in the woods and like worship God, because she just always wanted to be saying her prayers and focusing on the death and resurrection of Jesus. So she'd make a cross in the woods and go. And before I knew about her, I did that too. And I went out in the woods one day and I was going on that passage, like, he made them male and female. And I was like, this just always sucks to read, because it like, as I read it, I immediately feel tension and I feel like separated from who I am. Like I'm either the best thing God created or the worst thing, because of the way that passage has been used. like that there's this very essential difference between men and women, and like they're from totally different planets, nothing alike. And I was praying, I was doing the, Electa Divina on that passage. And finally, I felt the Holy Spirit kind of give me a really warm presence. And I just felt this like breath sound, this like that, like God's breath. And I remembered at the moment that it wasn't when God fashioned the body of Adam that it became a person. It was when God breathed the life into that person, that spirit. And I was like, I can accept myself because I am a woman. I am a daughter of God. I transitioned. I presented differently, but that spirit that God breathed in me was special. And I go to the other passage that was a clever passage. He knit you together in your mother's womb. He knows you full well. And that used to be used as a, like, look at, you're not living to God's intention. And that got flipped for me by the Holy Spirit to being like, I knew exactly who you were. And I think you're beautiful. And so I just think, and I think for like body image issues, like what Ben was talking about, I think what people don't also realize is that if you're a trans person that's choosing not to transition, the toxic way that we police women's bodies and like have this ideal beauty standard applies to even the trans folk that don't transition in a way that I think other men don't experience because they're not trying to fit that archetype. But even when you're not transitioning, even the times before I transitioned, I was always subconsciously trying to compare myself to that ideal. And I always fell short. Even after hormones, I can confess, I still fall short. But even before hormonal transition, like it was so much easier to like be like, I suck because I don't look like that. And I don't, and my body's this way in this area and I hate it. So I just like to bring that up, that it's like something that people don't think about is how the issues that a lot of women struggle with in terms of body image and issues apply to a lot of gender dysphoric people.
Y'all, I feel like we just went to church. I mean, we're like, literally, this is sacred grounds. Like, this is what a fantastic conversation. And yeah, like I think God is the one that gives us life. Like you were saying, like his breath is the life within us. And I think something that's so beautiful about all of our experiences as gender minorities, sexual minorities, is that like we have, not only do we have to see others, and we get the privilege of seeing others well, but I think like it constantly brings us back to God. Like I'm constantly brought back to God, because as much as I would try to be the perfect archetype, it just doesn't happen. Like it just doesn't exist in these bones, in this body. Yet I don't have to hate. We could choose to hate ourselves, and that's a part of the journey too. But there's also the choice to like look to the one who's the lover of our souls. And I hear that in both of your stories and experiences. So amazing.
Yeah, I also think that there's a myth that like because you transition, you like, I think Christians say like you must hate your body. And I went through a long process of not hating my body, but because I transitioned didn't mean I hated my body. And I think that's what people think is like, if you change your body, that means you hated it and you didn't respect it. For me, transition was actually a way that I became healthier. I was respecting and stewarding the body that God gave me to live in the most functional way I could. So,
Ben, I'm curious. I want to ask this question. I'm curious, like, just thinking about what Adelynn just said about loving your body. I've heard, we've talked about this a little bit before about like what, we kind of already said, like, what does it look like to have a gender expression? But I can think even deeper, what does it look like for you to love your body? Like, and forgive me if it's too personal. Josh can cut it out. I think all of our listeners probably have experienced it to some degree, and I'm yeah, I would just love to hear whatever you feel comfortable sharing. What does it look like for you to love your body? Is it even a thing you consider?
Yeah, it's a battle. It is a battle, a daily
Mm,
battle, and not one that I win often, I would say.
mm,
I think
mm.
there's some things, regardless of gender identity, that, is caring for your body. And it's like getting sleep, hydrating, like moving your body, like getting outside and doing something. Um, so I think I'm dealing with a lot of like personal things with that for sure. But there's definitely been moments when I do care for my body and I'm like, no, this is actually really important, that I can like feel it. It feels good. It feels like I'm doing something intentional. And I think part of it is sort of, like I said before, sort of relearning how I see myself. Like I am a human being and I love other people, so I can love myself. Like I can include myself in these things. And um as far as like dysphoria goes, I don't know if that it's like an actual physical practice, but I remember, I can't remember which airport I was in, but I just had like a wave of dysphoria that was really strong. It was super hard. And it was almost like every woman that I saw had what I could not have. And every man that I saw, especially older men, I'm like, that is like my destination and I hate it.
Wow.
And it was
Wow.
just overwhelming. And I remember coming up to one of those like fast tracks, right, where the belt goes a little faster, and I really just invited Jesus in. I need to do that more often, but I was like, Jesus, do you see me right now? Do you see like
Wow.
I'm hurting? And
Mm.
it actually lessened some of it to know that like he was listening, right? Like he was there in spirit with me. And I was still struggling in that moment, but even just to acknowledge it, to acknowledge the pain, to acknowledge sort of that overwhelming moment, and to invite Jesus in is a practice that I need to do. And it's not, I don't think it can be the only thing, right? But certainly it was good in that moment emotionally. I think, there's a lot more that I would be able to do. I think like fashion wise, I would love to do. There's like a certain ideal body that I would, want to work toward that would allow me to do more things. But yeah, I think it's been different since I've worked from home, right? Because it's like easy to just wear like shorts and a t-shirt and like that's great. But like to be able to acknowledge like to do what's flattering, to do what makes me feel good is really important, and to make sure that I'm addressing the physical needs is super important. So I don't know if that answers your question super well, but
No, it
yeah.
does. It does. It does, and I think like for me, it's something I take for granted every day. Is that don't get me wrong, I don't look in the mirror every day and I'm like, damn, you're hot, girl. Like I do that a lot actually,
So,
but
on the
not
good days.
every day. But I take for granted that I go to the store and I pick out a skirt or a dress or a top that I love and I buy it and that's the end. Like, and I can do that in the guy section. The little boy section of the store, of like clothing stores, is one of my favorites because everything fits and it has like a hint of, you know, it has a hint of lesbian like energy that I like to pick up every now and again. So, but that's a luxury. Like I just get that. And Ben, I even when asking like, do you feel like you have the license? And quickly you were like, no, like I I can't imagine what it's like to not only walk in the store, say, man, I love that, and then don't feel like you have the license to purchase it. But like you're saying at this airport, like literally looking at other people and saying, that will never be me. Like that's heavy stuff. That's a lot to carry. And I'm so grateful that you have a God that can carry it with you and for you.
Yeah. Expression's a hard thing too. I felt like in the first 3 years when I was at that conservative Christian college that like I didn't feel free to express myself or wear the things that I would want to wear because I felt at one point like I was all eyes were on me, first of all, because everyone was curious about how my body would change, you know? So it was like middle school, but like times 8 because I couldn't disappear because I was like this like circus creature that everyone like loved to like just see. And so I remembered like if I do my makeup and I mess up like many people do when they first start doing makeup when they're 12, that like people would mock me or make fun of me and be like, oh, like she's not a real woman or something like that. And then like how I dress even to this day is like based off of my comfortability of like expressing my femininity. So I feel like a lot of times I'm very androgynous because I've been hurt so badly by like presenting female that it's still hard sometimes because I have so much trauma with wearing the things I want to wear. And like also this weird never ending needle you have to thread of like not being too feminine. Otherwise people will be like, you're perpetuating a stereotype as a trans woman. Like you think women just wear dresses and makeup and high heels. And then if I'm not feminine enough, it's like, are you even trans? Like, why did you even do this? And I'm like, I can't win.
Yes.
And I think me and Ben shared that experience of like, for us, wearing things is never just wearing things.
Yeah.
Wow.
It just isn't. And it sucks.
It does
Because
suck.
I just want to focus on worshiping God or being in church and this is why I'm looking into more affirming churches because I don't even feel like I can focus on worshiping God when I'm wondering if someone knows I'm trans, thinking I'm trans, or found out I'm trans.
Wow. Wow.
It's so hard.
And that makes me so sad because there shouldn't just be one kind of church that opens its doors to anyone. I hate that's a reality. I'm so sorry to both of you. And Ben, by the way, everyone, I have seen Ben wear some fantastic outfits.
Oh, good.
Oh, yeah.
Good to hear.
No, for real, looking sharp. So when I come to Grand Rapids, we're gonna pick some things off the rack.
All right.
And just let it be
good.
what it is, Ben. So excited.
That's fun. I'm hearing shopping's free, so I'm in.
Shopping's awesome. That's great.
Okay, Ben, so another question directed for you. You know, you started to mention a little bit about being married and your wife, and I would love to hear a little bit from you about what's the experience like for you and your partner, and like how does she care for you? How do you care for her as you navigate transgender identity and gender dysphoria?
Yeah, we're figuring that out. Still trying to. So I guess I'll maybe recap.
That's the word of the episode.
Oh yeah, like
the word of the phrase is we're all trying to figure it out. That's the title.
On a side note, you ever hear those testimonies where it's like, I met Jesus and everything was just great afterward? Like,
yes.
I could not stand those testimonies. And I say that knowing like Jesus can totally like, I fully believe he can break addictions and patterns of sin and like totally renew someone. But that's just like one moment, right? And then I think about the letters that Paul wrote and like how screwed up the church is. Like he's actually addressing these things because they're actual issues with believers, which is important to know. But like it's never just one and done. It is always like now and not yet, right? So that's certainly the case with my marriage with Lauren. You know, Lauren is my best friend, and I love her so much. We have 2 golden retrievers that we love to care for, and we love our home, and there's so much that I think has been really fun to share our lives together. And it's a lot of work. It's hard. It's hard to live with someone else and be so vulnerable. You know, and I say that being very conscious of being on the Side B podcast, right? There's a lot of single people, and you know, whether and a lot by choice. And I guess I'm getting a little bit off track, but one of the things that's prevented me from transitioning has been my marriage. I don't, and I think that's fair, right? So Lauren married a man and is attracted to, this is interesting, she's attracted to my masculine physical qualities, but my like more feminine personality qualities. So it's kind of interesting. But it's like totally fair, right? Like to have to reflect, okay, is this something that we want to go to? And some people transition in their marriages, you know, they make it work, you know, and
Don't fall apart.
still are following Jesus, right? Like trying to make that work. I don't know. There's so many things that can happen in our lives that we can't foresee. You know, I think of like what happens if one of us gets in a car accident and we have to care for each other. Like, I mean, horrible situation, but sort of the cost of marriage, right, is to be there and sort of surrender my needs. I have to stand up for my needs too, but I need to care for this other person. And it's such a beautiful metaphor, I think, right? Like that's the goal, I think, of a Christian marriage, is to work to be the representation that, like, you know, God is there through the thick and thin. And that's been a challenge, and I think we've had to learn to compromise. And I think initially, you know, when I came out to her, it was really hard on her. You know, it's like, what is this going to mean for us? And you know, I don't know that we have like all these amazing practices that we've figured out, but one of the biggest things in any sort of relationship, marriage or not, is communication. And so one of the things that I try to do is let her know when I'm really struggling, when the dysphoria. So like dysphoria to me, I use this image of like a volume, right, on a radio. Sometimes it is just cranked up and it is so loud and distracting, and it's hard to like focus on anything else. And sometimes it's like a 1 out of 10 where it's like, if I really look, it's like, okay, yeah, it's there, but it's more like really low white noise, hardly even notice it. And so when it's really cranked up, I let her know. You know, that's something that's been helpful, I think, is just to make sure that there's some level of communication there. I also have other people that I can go to, other trans people that I can share with, you know, when my dysphoria is up. And you know, I think we're still figuring it out, but certainly there's a level of compromise that we're trying to work out. It's like, you know, what can I still do to address some of this dysphoria without like medically transitioning? And I think too, you know, Adelynn and I think would probably both agree with like Mark Yarhouse's sort of standard of like, do like the least amount to address the dysphoria. So like for some people it's really strong, like even for Adelynn, I'm not gonna speak for Adelynn, but right, like the physical piece was huge, right? Like her body is so much better now that she's transitioned. And I don't think I don't know. I'll get back to marriage, I guess. I think it's hard. I know people that have gotten divorced because one person, the dysphoria is just so strong, and the other person said, like, that's not going to be, that's not going to work. And that's heartbreaking, especially when kids are involved. And, but also, like, I have to remember too, like, divorce is not the worst thing in the world. It sucks. I'm never going to, like, promote it as the best thing, but God gives us this option to, in some ways, it promotes life, right? Like, if someone is absolutely suffering and there's no way to move forward in the relationship, like, yeah, it's not ideal, but I think maybe it's there for a reason. And, I don't know the status of the couple that I'm thinking of, but maybe, this person is more emotionally stable and, like, able to, like, care for themselves where they weren't able to before. Yeah. So, it's hard to, like, say that there's a one size fits all. There just isn't.
Yeah.
But for Lauren and I, we're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, and to be there for each other and to talk it through.
I've been there for a lot of. I've been there for a lot of couples too. Like, just from my years of being on Preston's podcast and whatnot, couples reach out, and it's always interesting to see. Like, I've talked to one couple that, like, I've seen their marriage get stronger in such a beautiful way because they're struggling with dysphoria together, and it's not like this thing that's, like, put on the margins of their marriage. But what I have tried to do with married folk when they ask me, like, how to go about this, and I'm not a counselor, but, I just try to think about it real carefully, is, like, you're one flesh. So just as much as one person can't do a unilateral decision, I think oftentimes I tell the other partner as well, you need to understand how difficult this is. And the fact that our marriage vows includes for sickness and health, like, sometimes this could be a very serious mental or physical issue. And so both people should always be trying to submit to one another and serve each other. I even think of one of the earliest examples of a trans person in Western society was way back in the 1930s with Lily Elbe. She was a Danish painter. It was dramatized in the movie The Danish Girl. Not the best movie, but that's what Hollywood did with it. Anyway, her wife was very instrumental. Yeah, her wife was very instrumental in helping her along that transition, even though it meant the death of her husband. But because her love was so strong for this person she married, and she finally realized there's no way that this person is getting out of it alive, then she was on board of trying to get the help that person needed. So I think those stories can be very beautiful, even though they're very difficult.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. And I've seen Lauren and Ben in action, and, like, Ben, I'm sure it's not perfect, but I admire your resilience. No pun intended. That is the topic or our topic of the season. And I think your marriage really does speak to what resilience looks like in this experience. So, and I wanted to ask a question about resilience. However, I'm realizing we've been just talking about resilience this whole hour, and in different forms and fashions. And I'm in awe of the resilience of both of you in the diverse ways that you've chosen resilience. You've chosen life. You've chosen Christ. It is inspiring to me, and I'm sure to all the listeners here, whether they experience gender dysphoria or not. Like, wow, what a testimony to God's goodness. So, but before we close, there's one question that we always ask, and I want to make sure we get this in. So if you could share just one thing to your younger self, pick an age, what would be that thing that you would share with yourself?
Even knowing this question ahead of time, like what would that be? You know, like just trying to ponder it. And I there's just different moments. Even like 6-year-old kid, 16-year-old kid, where I'm just like, you are worthy of love. Like you are beautiful and you're worth it. And that's something that I'm learning myself now, and I wish I would have really had a good grasp of that as a younger kid. So that's what I would tell my younger self. You're worthy. You're worth it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. There are people who needed to hear that today, Ben. So thank you for telling 16-year-old you and a bunch of other people that you'll never meet how worthy they are. Good word. Adelynn, take us out.
Yeah. I would have told that little girl that she had the permission to be herself, to be okay with how she's different than all of the other boys that were in the class. And I would have also just reminded her that no matter what happens, that Jesus is going to be there and he's going to sustain you. And that there's like a light at the end of the tunnel. Like I felt like if I knew there was a light at the end of the tunnel, like I would have been so much more calm to like enjoy where I was at the given mount. And just also like, I would tell her like, God has been so good and I'm so grateful because even though my childhood was so different than most of my girlfriends, I also had a lot of normality, and that I can only attribute to God. Like I had a bunch of really good girlfriends on the playground. Like I didn't have to play football all the time. You know, I just got so many good moments that like spoke to my soul, like good sleepovers and good chats and like just people that saw me at each stage of my life, even before I transitioned. So that's what I would have told me many, many years ago. I'm old now.
So good. So good. Well, all I can say is thank you for letting me hopefully be more of a fly on the wall in this conversation and just gleaning from both of your hearts and your wisdom and experience. And I guess all I can say other than thank you is it's thank you for being you. Thank you for letting me and the world see who you truly are. And thank you for doing it in a faithful walk with Christ. Like, truly, truly paving the way. What a blessing to the body. Whether they tell you or not, you both are such a blessing to our community and to the church at large. So thank you both for being you. And thanks for being here today.
It's such a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
So good to see you. Yes.